John Corby pulled the cloth covering his face tighter as he strode through the thick smoke and ash that permeated Sahula's city streets. In some places, the smoke was so dense he had to lead with his hands to avoid running into something face first. The light from Tiala Prime's star gave the city an eerie look from being filtered by the rising columns of smoke. Numerous fires burned all over the city, and no one was willing to risk the relative safety of any shelter they had found. Various odors saturated the smoke, which was stronger depending on how close you got to what was burning. Woods of several types made up the bulk of the smell, but there were also plastics, electrical and fiber optic wiring, paint, melting glass, and the faux rubber used as tires for the local conveyances. But there were other smells he tried not to think about. Those smells would haunt him for the rest of his life. He heard the sound of laughter from up ahead. It wasn't a pleasant kind of laugh either. The terrified screams that came from the source of their laughter made him hurry as fast as he could. After being kicked or battered down, he came upon a door that was barely attached to the frame. Inside were 5 Threxeran soldiers, surrounding a pair of Parkinian women cowering on the floor beneath them. The still forms of 3 other Parkinian males showed exactly what kind of fun they were having and the fate of the 2 women after the Threxerans were finished with them. He entered the room and shouted, "Don't touch those women," as he strode up to the soldiers. He'd caught them by surprise, but they spun around quickly, weapons ready. His anger kept the urge to flee under control. He saw the look on their faces change from surprise to anger at their sport being interrupted. Corby pulled down his facial covering and glared at who he assumed was their leader. The leader stammered while trying to answer Corby. Corby shouted at the leader again, "What was that? I can't hear you." "A human, sir," he finally managed to get out. "And did you get the new order that Parkinian civilians were not to be harmed from now on?" Corby asked, keeping his voice steady and menacing. "Under penalty of death?" The Threxerans all shook their heads in the negative reply. They were beginning to get too scared to even speak. Threxeran military justice for disobeying an order was swift and brutal. Corby pretended to think before speaking again. "Since you didn't know, I will spare your lives by not mentioning this disobedience to the general when we meet later." The soldiers began to express their gratitude, but Corby interrupted them. He pointed to a device on his torso. "This records and uploads everything in real time, so I will need to return to the campus and erase it." He gestured to the women. "Give them to me and I'll take them there. They won't be able to say anything, and you can leave this area. Find a spot where more of your comrades are and pretend to do something official. That way, if anyone asks, they'll say you've been there all afternoon." The Threxerans once again talked over each other to thank him. The soldiers saluted and practically tripped over each other as they fled out of the door. Corby looked at the 2 women. "Get dressed, grab some things, and follow me." While they gathered some possessions, he took the sheets off the beds and covered the 3 bodies. He also mentally thanked an old professor who advised him to take some dramatic speaking classes to improve his oration when giving lectures. It served him well in his years as a professor and then chancellor of the university he founded here. It also helped him bluff the Threxerans into obeying a non-existent order, and hopefully he'd persuaded them to lay low long enough to let him find and guide a few more civilians to the safe zone he had created at his university. The last thing the general or Threxeran leadership wanted was for the humans to interfere in this world's internal affairs, and he took advantage of that as far as he could and hoped none of the soldiers tried to check with their officers about it. Now that he was guiding 2 civilians to safety, he was glad for the smoke. He reached the university gates with no more incidents. He turned the women over to one of his students and sat to guzzle some water. One of the professors who was now guarding the gate came to check on him. He took another swig from the jug, and I had to bluff a group of Threxeran soldiers making sport of some civilians. I haven't always been thrilled with how intimidating my people can be, but I am damn thankful for it now. Corby thought for a moment. I got enough time for one more run before it gets full dark. If anything keeps those bastards out of the campus, it's a 3-meter-tall Devlonian with a big club in each of his 6 hands. It was almost midnight when he came back empty-handed. He decided to grab a quick bite and maybe a couple of hours of sleep. His eyes felt gritty from the smoke and lack of sleep. But sleep eluded him. Too much had happened in the last couple of days since a Threxiran army attacked the city. He thought of the devastation he'd seen and what it looked like when he first arrived in Sehula. It was 25 years ago that an idealistic young man came to this planet with grandiose ideas about creating a university to rival some of the best in the galaxy. He loved Tiala Prime from the moment he arrived, almost as much as he loved Earth. He loved hiking its verdant hills, the shades of purple, blue, and pink of the forests, and he loved the people. He had friends from both species that evolved on this planet. He just wished the two races got along better. There was very little difference between the two physically. Many outsiders had trouble seeing those cues. The Parkinians and the Threxer had been in conflict since they discovered each other. The Parkinians lived in the northern hemisphere, while the Threxer controlled the southern one. Their entire history was filled with wars, death, and blood that put human history to shame. But there was hope when the humans made first contact and then introduced them to the many other races in the galaxy. For a time, the shock of learning they weren't alone caused them to set aside their differences and reap the benefits of contact. They later learned from others just how lucky they were to meet the humans first. While some of the races would have conquered and enslaved them, the humans preferred peaceful relations for trade and learning all they could to sate their voracious appetite for knowledge. They also tried not to meddle in the internal affairs of other races. But preferring peace did not make them opposed to war, as several species found out when humans first made contact with others. And so very few races would cross the humans for something as minor as exploiting a new world. Humans rarely do things by half when it comes to warfare, which meant the people of Tiala Prime enjoyed the first extended period of peace in centuries. Led by the humans, many different races came to trade with both Parkinians and Threxirans, and both peoples enjoyed prosperity. And Corby was one of those people that flocked to Tiala Prime. Being new to the galactic community offered new opportunities to create something not constrained by the traditional ideas of most other universities. And so he began to fulfill his dream in a Parkinian city close to their border with the Threxir. With a view of the majestic mountains to the north and to the south was the meandering Nolobo River, its tranquil waters flowing clear and pure over the rocky bottom. The city of Sehula spanned both sides of the river with a pair of bridges connecting them. Its proximity to the border caused the city to flourish in trade, and the university brought in members of dozens of races to study or just visit. The population exploded until 500,000 beings called Sehula home. Corby's pride and joy was located close to the river, its vast campus surrounded by low walls and towers to look like something from the folklore of both peoples. Vines cascaded down the walls in shades of green and pink over the yellow stone walls. The towers were places to study the night sky, conduct experiments that needed solitude, or just take in the beauty around them. Stately buildings were surrounded by stunning gardens that gave the campus a serene atmosphere. Traders, merchants, scholars, businesses, and craftsmen flocked to Sehula. The rise of merchants and traders began influencing their respective governments to avoid large conflicts. After all, they were bad for business. A lasting peace brought in even more business. All of this brought prosperity and fame to the city on the river. And that prosperity led the city elders to lavish vast sums to make Sehula the jewel of Tiala Prime. But prosperity also breeds jealousy, and jealousy can breed hatred. Greed begets more greed, and some would stoop to almost anything to protect what they have or obtain more. The Threxir nobility hungered for the old ways of blood and battle. This left them vulnerable to manipulation by the newly rich traders and merchants, and in turn, the nobles encouraged the lower classes to follow their lead. They tried to stir the old hatred by claiming the Parkinians were preventing them from enjoying the same level of prosperity, claiming wealthy Parkinians were stealing Threxiran children and forcing them into servitude in their households. Threxiran entertainment channels brought out the old insulting names of their rivals. Caches of weapons were said to be hidden all over the country in border towns. There were rumors of Threxiran men training in the countryside, far from prying eyes, but there were always rumors claiming that, so why listen to them now? An appointment with the city elders led him to the city center, and the feeling just got worse. And then he thought back several days before when it began. Corby had gone back to his office to make some calls when his assistant burst in. An army of Threxerans just crossed the border and heading this way. 2 other armies had crossed the border near other cities as well. He turned to his assistant. While I am gone, round up anyone you can find and hang or paint flags of the Terran Union. If nothing else, we can try and make this a safe zone to protect the people. Corby got into his vehicle and set out to meet this army. If it was just a mob, maybe he could scare them with threats of a human response to their actions. But he was dismayed when he got a view of the Threxerans. The Threxeran army accompanied the mob of armed militia. The Threxeran officers and nobles knew about the human policy of non-interference in internal matters. There was no way to bluff them, but he remembered something from an old history text. And so he was brought before the leader of this army, General Dryan. It took some fast talking, but he managed to convince the general to respect the university grounds as a safety zone, but for civilians only. He explained that while the humans wouldn't respond to an internal conflict, they would respond if anything happened to him, the other humans, and all the aliens on campus. But he had to agree that military-age Parkinian men were not allowed inside, but he convinced him to allow those on staff to remain. Corby hoped to slip more of the male civilians, but the general was shrewd. He sent an officer to inspect and record their ID papers. Corby barely remembers what happened after his meeting. It was just a whirlwind of images in his mind. Stocking up supplies, gathering refugees, and closing the campus off except for the main gate and a small door on each of the other walls. From one of the towers, Corby and the others watched in horror as the Threxerans reached the bridges. The refugees crammed on the bridges never had a chance. Their cries were terrible to hear, and the river ran green from all the blood spilled in it. Once the Threxerans reached the bridges, the river became choked with the bodies of the living and the dead thrown from the bridges. He saw the bodies of children among the bodies carried downriver by the stream. Corby was so upset that he called the Terran embassy and described exactly what happened. When the embassy contacted him after they talked to the Terran government, it was just as he feared. They refused to interfere in an internal matter. He wanted to rage against the bearer of bad news, but he heard the same mix of sorrow and anger in their voice as his. So instead, he relayed the plans for the safe zone and recommended implementing it in other cities. With no one to resist them, the city fell in a matter of hours. Corby hoped the worst was over, but it had just begun. Any control of the mob of Threxeran militia and soldiers was lost within hours of the city's fall. Armed gangs of Threxerans roamed the streets, looting, burning, murdering, torturing, and assaulting the civilian population. Throngs of Parkinian men were rounded up and marched off to entertain Threxerans in manners that made death a blessing. Slowly but surely, the officers began to regain control of their men, and the militia was brought into line. At least during the day, groups of Threxerans still roamed the streets, hoping to catch an unwary civilian to make sport of. And every night, Corby alone, or with Hake accompanying him, would head out into the streets to try and prevent that from happening. He talked, bluffed, bribed, wheedled, or threatened, especially when Hake was with him. It took a very brave man to stand up to a human and a Devlonian carrying multiple clubs, and tried to save as many as they could. Corby and the other humans and aliens worked around the clock to treat and care for the tens of thousands of refugees that sheltered on campus. This continued for over a week before the humans and other members of the galactic community finally took steps to end this conflict. At great risk to itself, Astrikax managed to smuggle out a data cube filled with images and video of the atrocities committed. It got the cube to the Terran embassy and had an unblocked communication channel. The Threxerans had jammed the rest but weren't willing to risk cutting the Terran embassy off completely. Those images finally shamed the galactic community to take action. A fleet of warships in orbit is a wonderful incentive to make peace. It took years for Sahula to regain his former glory, and it would take decades of physical, mental, and emotional healing for the survivors. The staff of the safety zone took solace in saving tens of thousands of civilians from the Threxerans. For Corby and others, there was no healing from the things they did and saw. So they focused on bringing as many of the war criminals to justice as they could, and they weren't too picky about their condition when they turned them over to the authorities.
If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.